Today we're going to look at stem-changing verbs in the present tense. Please remember that the rules and explanations you're going to be looking at today apply only to the present tense and only to the stem-changing verbs. Okay, in order to understand well stem-changing verbs and how to conjugate them, we need to review a few verb basics. These things apply to all verbs in Spanish. First, remember that all of the regular verbs in Spanish are made up of two parts, a stem and an ending. For example, the verb cantar has the stem cant, which means sing, while the AR ending identifies the verb as an infinitive, or in English, to sing. Okay, to understand how to conjugate a stem-changing verb, it's important that we review how to conjugate the regular verbs. When we conjugate regular verbs, we follow a specific pattern. For example, if we wanted to conjugate the verb cantar, we would follow this pattern. First, we'd look at the ending of the verb, that AR, that infinitive marker. That tells us that this verb will use the regular AR verb endings. O, as, a, amos, ais, an. Now, if we want to change that verb cantar from to sing to I sing, the first step is going to be to remove that infinitive marker, that AR. Once we've removed the AR, then we can take the O ending and we can move it over. And then we have the verb canto, which means I sing. Now there are similarities between the stem-changing verbs and regular verbs. The first and probably the most important similarity is that both the stem-changing verbs and the regular verbs use the same set of endings. They use the regular verb endings o, as, a, amos, an, o, es, e, emos, en, or o, es, e, imos, en. The process for conjugating a stem-changing verb is very similar to the one for regular verbs. The first step again is to remove the AR, ER, or IR infinitive marker from the end of the verb. However, before we can add the endings, we have to look at the stems. Most of the forms for these verbs are going to require a spelling change in the stem. Now let's look at the spelling change. Our textbook will typically identify stem-changing verbs by including a parenthetical notation on the vocabulary list, that last page of each chapter. So if you looked at the verb poder on a vocab list, you would see a parenthetical notation of O, arrow, UE. This notation identifies the verb as a stem-changing verb and tells us that in the present tense, the O's will become UE's within the forms that change. Now, where do the spelling changes occur? If we were to look at the conjugation chart for the verb poder, it would look like this. Puedo, puedes, puede, podemos, podes, pueden. You will notice that all of the forms except the nosotros form and the vosotros form contain the spelling change. I think it's important that we make the stem-changing verbs memorable. The easiest way to remember which forms change and which ones don't is to draw a line around the forms that change. When you do this, you notice the line looks like a boot or a Christmas stocking. I like to say it's a Christmas stocking, and only those inside the stocking received presents, so they're the only ones that can change. If you're outside the stocking, you didn't receive any gifts. Therefore, you have no new clothes to change into. Okay, now let's look at an example of a stem-changing verb. Let's use the verb querer, to want. The first thing you should notice about the verb querer is that it's an ER verb. This means it's going to use the regular ER verb endings. O, es, hemos, es, en. Now you should also remember, because you've memorized it, that this is a stem-changing verb, E to IE. This means we're going to work with two different stems as we conjugate this verb into present tense. The regular stem, where we simply took the ER off, care, and the form that has the spelling change in it, quier. Now, we need to remember that we're going to use care outside the boot and quier inside the boot. So when we conjugate querer, it's going to look like this. Quiero, quieres, quiere, queremos, quieres, quieren. Notice that inside the boot we've used the IE stem change. Outside the boot we've used our regular stem. How do we know when and how to change these stems? How do we know which verbs will change and what those changes will be? We memorize. You must memorize these changes. That's the only way to know that they will take place. It's the only way to be able to conjugate correctly. To help you begin to correctly conjugate the stem-changing verbs, I want to include a list of verbs you may already know that are stem-changing. The first group on the list are O to UE stem-changing verbs. These verbs are poder, almorzar, dormir, and costar. Also on this list, we're going to include the verb jugar, which is actually a U to UE stem-changing verb, but is the only U to UE stem-changing verb you will learn. The second group of verbs have E to IE stem changes, such as querer did. Verbs you've already learned like this are empezar, pensar, preferir, querer, and then even though they have irregular yo forms, tener and venir work exactly like stem-changing verbs once you get past the tengo, vengo. The last group of stem-changing verbs are E to I verbs. Verbs in this group that you've already learned are pedir, servir, and repetir. A few final thoughts about stem-changing verbs. First, if the stem-changing verb has a stem with 2 of the letter that needs to be changed in it, we change the second letter. Examples like this are preferir and repetir. Preferir is an E to IE stem-changing verb, but the stem has 2 E's in it. So we change the second to an IE. So I prefer becomes prefiero. Second, realize that this is not a complete list of stem-changing verbs. You will want to memorize these verbs and then add new ones as you are introduced to them. Each time you begin to learn a stem-changing verb, it's important that you memorize its meaning and the fact that it's stem-changing and what the change is, so that you're able to conjugate it correctly as you need to use it.